I stood in the pouring rain, staring at a small mahogany casket being lowered into the ground, the dark hole seeming too deep for a 9-year-old boy. Mud splattered on my dress, soaking through the fabric, chilling me to the bone. The minister's voice was barely audible as he spoke his words, feeling like they were meant for someone else, not me. I looked at the empty folding chairs in the front row, 5 seats meant for family, but none of them were filled. I had always believed family would show up in moments like these, but they didn't. No one came. And then, as if the world hadn't already shattered enough, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Expecting maybe a remorseful message or a simple apology, I pulled it out, shielding it from the rain. But it wasn't an apology, it was a text from my mother. "Stop being dramatic. The funeral is just a formality. Bring the insurance papers to Sarah's engagement party now. We need to settle this." I stared at the words. My son was being buried, and my mother was more concerned with paperwork for a party. The disconnect was unbearable. The world had never seemed so cold, so empty. And yet there I was, standing alone in the rain, feeling like I had just lost everything while my family moved on, untouched by the grief that consumed me. I didn't go home to change. The mud still clung to my heels as I climbed into the car. The scent of damp earth and funeral flowers mixed in my nostrils. I didn't scrape it off, didn't wipe the rain from my face. The heater blasted, but it couldn't warm me. I couldn't feel the heat. All I could feel was the buzzing of my phone in my pocket, another reminder that this moment, my son's funeral, my grief was somehow secondary to the cold business of my family's needs. As I pulled into the driveway of the Grand Oak Country Club, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, the skin on my knuckles pale from the pressure. My heart hammered in my chest, not from fear, but from the overwhelming disconnect between the world I was walking into and the one I had just left behind. The contrast was jarring. I stepped out of the car, mud on my dress, and walked past the valet, who gave me an unsure glance before I ignored him and headed inside. I felt every step of that walk like a betrayal. The doors opened, and the sharp scent of expensive perfume and roasted garlic hit me. Laughter echoed in the halls, light and carefree, the sound of people whose only worry was whether the champagne was chilled enough. A world away from the cold emptiness I had just left. I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror in the hallway, a distorted reflection in a gilded frame. My black dress soaked and clinging to my skin, my hair plastered to my face. A woman drenched in rain and grief, standing in a room filled with people who couldn't have cared less. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life. But it was mine. I didn't belong here. I didn't want to be here, but I had no choice. My mother intercepted me before I could even step into the ballroom. She grabbed my arm with a grip that hurt, dragging me away from the laughter, the champagne, and into the private bridal suite. "You look like a disaster," she hissed. Her voice was sharp, condescending. "We have guests, Lisa. Important guests. Couldn't you at least have cleaned up?" She shoved me into the room, and there stood my sister Sarah, touching up her lipstick in front of a vanity. Her eyes flicked over me up and down with the kind of bored disinterest I was all too familiar with. It was like I wasn't even human to her. "Did you bring the check?" she asked, her voice flat, matter of fact, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "David is waiting to announce the venue expansion, and we need the deposit cleared." I stood there, water dripping from my coat onto the plush carpet. My son had just been buried, and my sister was talking about deposits. about a party extension. The anger bubbled up inside me, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't scream. Not yet. I just stared at Sarah, at her perfect face, her pristine clothes, and I thought about how easy it must have been for her to continue on, to let her life go on while mine had crumbled. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I just buried my son. I said my voice. Quieter than it should have been, dangerous in its calmness. But my sister didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she rolled her eyes, that all too familiar gesture that made my stomach twist. She reached into her designer clutch, pulling out a piece of heavy cream-colored stationery. She slid it across the vanity table toward me like it was nothing more than an afterthought. I looked down at it. It wasn't a condolence note. It wasn't an apology. It was an invoice. "It's not just for the party, Lisa," Sarah said, her voice cold. "It's compensation. We did the math." I stared at the paper, feeling the world tilt beneath me. Emotional distress caused by Noah's diagnosis. Cancellation fees for Cabo trip due to surgery scare. General loss of social standing due to family depression. The total at the bottom was circled in red ink. Sarah had made a calculation. She was charging me for my son's illness, for the burden of having a sick child. The room spun. I couldn't breathe. For a second, I thought I might collapse, but I didn't. I folded the paper carefully, still staring at it, and tucked it into my pocket. I didn't scream. I didn't shout. But the disgust, the rage, the betrayal, it was all there. It was burning through me. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and realized in that moment that I wasn't looking at family. I was looking at a parasite in silk. I stared at the paper in front of me, the words swimming in and out of focus. Emotional distress caused by Noah's diagnosis. Cancellation fees for a trip they couldn't take because of a surgery scare. General loss of social standing due to the family depression. The numbers were clean, crisp, calculated. Every line item seemed more absurd than the last, and yet they were real. My sister had sat down, looked at my son's suffering, and put a price tag on it. And somehow, that was the least shocking part of this whole twisted ordeal. No, what shocked me most was how easily she had done it. How casually she had spun my son's pain into something she could monetize, as if it was nothing more than an inconvenience, a bump in her life's perfect road. I could feel my pulse quicken as my mind tried to process what was happening. I had never imagined anything like this, not from Sarah, not from my own flesh and blood. How could anyone look at a child, a dying child, and turn his suffering into an invoice? A shiver ran down my spine, not from the cold of the rain or the dampness of my dress, but from something much colder. Something that crawled under my skin and made my blood run hot and still at the same time. I folded the paper slowly, deliberately, still staring at it as if somehow, if I stared hard enough, the words would change. But they didn't. They stayed the same. "You think you're owed this," I said, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, but still steady, controlled. My sister's eyes flickered to mine, her expression hardening the smile that had been playing at the corners of her lips, vanishing as she realized I wasn't reacting the way she had expected. "I know I am," she said, her voice flat sure of herself, as though this was all perfectly reasonable. I could feel my stomach twisting on itself. I didn't understand how she could be so calm, so cold. Did she really think she had a right to this money? To this money meant for my son's legacy? I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a realization, a bitter, awful truth. This wasn't about my son. This wasn't even about me. This was about Sarah and the sick, twisted way she saw the world. And I saw her for who she really was now. My own sister had been calculating her loss of social standing as if it was a number in a ledger. She hadn't been concerned about Noah. She hadn't been concerned about me. She was concerned with how this all looked, how this all felt to her, how it inconvenienced her life, a life that had been built on appearances and superficialities, and now she was trying to squeeze money out of my grief. I felt my hands trembling slightly as I folded the invoice and slid it into my pocket. The disgust, the disbelief, the gut-wrenching horror, it was all there rolling in waves inside me. But I didn't scream. I didn't react. I simply stood there staring at her and realized that what I had once called family was nothing but a masquerade. And I was done pretending. The tension in the room shifted the air, thickening with an unspoken threat. My father stepped forward, blocking my exit, his towering frame casting a long shadow. His eyes, once warm with the look of a father who had comforted me in the past, were now cold, calculating. He didn't look at me like his daughter anymore. He looked at me like a problem to be solved. His voice dropped low, rumbling with an authority he always thought he had over me. "You're being incredibly selfish, Lisa," he said, his words sharp, controlled. "Your sister has a future. He has a life to build. Noah's gone. Hoarding that money won't bring him back. It's immoral to let it sit there when your family is suffering." I met his gaze, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, but my expression remained steady. The words, the accusations, they stung, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. I wasn't the girl who used to shrink under his gaze, not anymore. Suffering, I asked, my voice even quieter than I felt. "You're drinking Dom Perignon while I have grave dirt under my fingernails. You don't know the meaning of the word." My father's face reddened, his jaw tightening, but I stood my ground. My mother moved to step in, her voice trembling in a way I recognized all too well. She stepped forward, clutching her handkerchief like a lifeline, her words dripping with false sincerity. "We are destitute, Lisa. We spent everything trying to maintain our image during that difficult time. We have debts. If you don't help us, we lose everything." I didn't blink. I didn't look away. "That's a lie," I said flatly, cutting her off. "You just bought a boat." The room seemed to hold its breath. But I wasn't done. I wasn't finished with this charade. My father's intimidation tactics, the empty threats, they didn't work on me anymore. I had something more than they could ever understand. I had my son's memory, and I wasn't going to let them tarnish it. Not for $1, not for anything. My calm was absolute. "No," I said, my voice clear, unwavering. It was the smallest word, but it carried weight. "No." My father leaned in closer, his breath carrying the sharp sting of scotch, the words that followed, colder than anything I'd felt before. "Listen to me," he said, his voice almost a growl. "You think you have a choice? You don't. We've already spoken to a lawyer." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle like a stone in the pit of my stomach. "Ever hear of filial responsibility laws?" I stared at him, the term foreign, chilling. In this state, he continued, his tone growing smug. "If we can prove destitution, it's not impossible to sue you for support. We'll claim you're abandoning us. Your assets, your wages, they'll be ours. You'll lose everything." The air in the room thickened, pressing in on me, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. They were cornering me. They knew I wouldn't just hand over the money, so now they were going to drag me through the mud, make me the villain in their twisted story. My mother stepped forward, her face a mask of feigned concern, but her voice, hard and unyielding, gave her away. "We'll bleed you dry, Lisa. You don't want to test us. You'll regret it." The threat hung in the air like smoke, but I didn't flinch. Not this time. They were desperate. Desperate to control me, to manipulate me into giving up what was rightfully mine. But I wouldn't let them. I had a plan, and they wouldn't see it coming. I walked out of that room, but my mind was already working, already plotting. The walls of the Ritz had closed in on me, but outside the world felt different. I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was something else now. I was a hunter. The first step was knowing how far they would go, how far they had already gone. I had to be smarter than them. I had to think ahead. I wasn't going to just play defense. I was going to destroy their credibility before they could even make a move. I needed something they couldn't deny, something that would make them squirm when the truth was exposed. That's when I remembered a conversation, a joke Sarah had made 2 days before Noah's death. She had laughed about how expensive cemetery plots were suggested. We just cremate him and save the real estate. It made my skin crawl, but it also gave me an idea. I went to the cemetery early the day before the funeral. Under the cover of darkness, I set up 3 trail cameras high in the trees surrounding the plot. Camouflage casing motion activated with night vision. They wouldn't even know they were being watched. It was the perfect trap. I knew they couldn't resist. I knew they would try to take what wasn't theirs. And when they did, I'd have proof. Proof that would expose them all. I wasn't just preparing for a legal battle. I was setting the stage for their downfall. A week later, I walked into the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, a completely different woman. Gone was the grieving mother, the one who had been swallowed by loss. In her place was a woman with purpose, her eyes sharp, her step calculated. The crimson dress I wore clung to me like armor, tailored to perfection. I felt it, the shift. I wasn't here to beg to cower. I wasn't here to fight with words. I was here to end this. My family had underestimated me. They thought I was weak, a victim, but I had learned the game. And now I was going to play it better than they ever could. The moment I stepped inside, their gazes found me, and I could see the relief in their eyes. Relief that they thought they had won. Sarah smiled, her usual smugness returning as she saw me, probably expecting me to fold to hand over the money she thought was hers. But she had no idea what I was holding. My father and mother too, their faces twisted with that same old entitlement, that same familiar arrogance. I moved through the crowd with ease, my movements fluid, composed. I could feel their eyes on me, but I didn't flinch. As I reached the podium, I met their gaze one last time, their vanity blinding them to what was coming. The ballroom was full of laughter, clinking glasses, the faint sound of a jazz band. But I had something else in mind. I clicked a button and the screen behind me came to life. The footage played, and as Sarah's voice echoed through the room, the air shifted. Their greed, their cruelty, all of it laid bare. This was my moment. Their vanity would be their undoing. The moment the footage played, everything shifted. The room froze. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the chatter, it all stopped. Sarah's voice filled the room. Cold and detached, her words dripping with greed, revealing the true nature of my family's lies. I watched as their faces drained of color, their carefully constructed masks shattering in an instant. Sarah's smile faltered, then disappeared, replaced by wide-eyed panic. My father's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. My mother, who had always prided herself on being the perfect picture of grace, stood there trembling, unable to speak. The room was silent, all eyes on them as their web of deception unraveled. William, the fiancé, looked sick, his eyes darting between Sarah and the screen as the reality set in. The damage was done. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Within minutes, Sarah's engagement was over. William walked out, his face a mix of disbelief and disgust. The creditors were the next to arrive, swarming like vultures, making demands, threatening lawsuits. It didn't take long for their world to collapse in on itself. And through it all, I stood there, calm, composed, a quiet observer to their unraveling. It felt surreal, like I was watching a show I had no part in, but I was part of this story too. The anger that had burned in me for so long finally faded, replaced by something else: peace. The storm had passed and I had won. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I was free. As I stood at the grave once more, the weight of everything that had happened finally sank in. The money, the lies, the betrayal, none of it mattered anymore. I had fought for my son's memory, for the dignity that had been stripped away by the very people who should have loved him most. And I had won. But it wasn't just the battle that had changed me, it was what I had learned about myself. For so long, I had allowed my family to define me, to shape my reality with their manipulation and their demands. But in the end, I had defined myself. I had found my voice, my strength. And in doing so, I had liberated myself. I stood there alone in the quiet of the cemetery, and for the first time, I felt at peace. The grief was still there. Yes, it would always be there, but it no longer controlled me. I had saved myself, and in doing so, I had finally freed Noah's memory from the clutches of a family that had never understood him. It was a painful, hard-won freedom, but it was mine, and it was enough. I knew now that loyalty, not blood, was what truly mattered, and with that, I was free. If you've found strength in this story, if you've ever had to fight for what's yours, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Sometimes we all need a little reminder of our own power.